And in 60 minutes, it's the why factor.
Heartbreak after love lost has been written about for generations. But what causes these feelings? And what does science have to say about it?
Stay with us. The newsroom is next on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
It's 22 hours GMT, and this is the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Emilio Sampedro. President Trump is seeking big increases in spending on defense and immigration enforcement and large cuts to social and environmental programs in his proposed election year budget.
We're putting out a plan today that over a period of not that long a period of time brings our budget and our deficit down to what it should be, which is close to zero.
Turkey says its forces have hit more than 100 Syrian government targets in a major flare-up in tensions. The U.S. has charged 4 Chinese military officers over a huge cyber attack on the credit rating agency Equifax. And
why should I have to cut my hair and people can have their hair all the way down to their hips and as long as they want? But because my hair grows out, I need to cut it.
A British student was repeatedly sent home from school because of the size of her afro wins her legal battle. That's all coming up here on the BBC World Service after the news.
I'm Stuart McIntosh with the BBC News. Hello. President Trump has sent his budget to the US Congress for approval, including big increases in military spending. The proposals also include a major boost to spending on nuclear weapons. Here's Michelle Fleury.
In his budget plan, Donald Trump wants to increase spending on defense and immigration enforcement and slash spending on social safety net programs. The budget also calls for a 21% cut to foreign aid, a 26% cut for the Environmental Protection Agency, and a 9% cut in the budget of the Health and Human Services Agency, even as the coronavirus spreads. Under Mr. Trump's watch, the deficit has increased by roughly $1 trillion for every year of his presidency. The budget must also be approved by Congress. But with Democrats still in charge of the House of Representatives, the chances of this plan becoming law are limited.
The 2 U.S. Democrats who lead the presidential caucus in Iowa have both requested a partial recount of the result. The left-wing Senator Bernie Sanders narrowly lost to his rival Pete Buttigieg in a chaotic contest in which technical problems delayed the result for days. The Iowa Democratic Party will consider the requests. Opinion polls put Mr. Sanders in the lead in the next part of the presidential race, the New Hampshire primary, which takes place on Tuesday. Addressing supporters in Rindge, New Hampshire, Mr. Sanders said he had the majority of support of those who cast ballots in Iowa.
Now, all of you are aware that they have a little bit of problems counting the votes in Iowa. I think they're still counting the votes in Iowa. But at the end of the day, what we know is we won the popular vote by 6,000 votes.
The Turkish Defense Ministry says that its military has hit 115 Syrian government targets in response to an earlier attack on Ankara's forces in northwestern Syria. With more details, here's our Arab Affairs editor, Sebastian Usher.
Turkey has said that it will continue to retaliate against pro-government forces in Idlib after the second attack in a week on its soldiers. The escalation has seen the first direct clashes between Turkish and Syrian troops. It comes as jihadists and rebel fighters try to launch a counter-offensive against pro-government forces in Idlib. Hundreds of thousands of civilians have fled the fighting, which has seen President Assad's troops take a string of towns and villages as they move towards the provincial capital of the mainly rebel-held province.
The United States has charged 4 members of China's People's Liberation Army over the hack in 2017 of its credit rating giant Equifax. U.S. Attorney General William Barr said the data breach was one of the biggest ever. Nearly 150 million Americans were affected when hackers stole personal information, including names and addresses. This is the latest world news from the BBC. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has made his first public appearance in days as the country tackles the coronavirus outbreak. He wore a blue surgical mask to tour public offices in Beijing. He later told Chinese state television that his government would work to prevent large-scale layoffs due to the coronavirus outbreak, which has now killed more than 900 people. Here's Seela.
The people at the very top of China's ruling Communist Party are often made out to be almost superhuman. We know very little about their private lives, and yet today we see Xi Jinping, China's president, the leader of the Communist Party, walking around Beijing wearing a face mask and also not wanting to shake hands with some of the people he was meeting, explaining that we were dealing with special circumstances. It was a strange, jarring sight of this superhuman figure suddenly appearing human.
A court in France has begun hearing a case of alleged gross negligence against the state brought by a French woman whose sister and parents were shot dead by the sister's former partner. Kathy Thomas has said her sister, Isabelle, was not protected by the authorities despite having lodged complaints for domestic violence. The state denies the accusation. 7 Tanzanians have launched a legal case at the High Court in London against one of the world's largest gold mining companies. They're accusing the security forces and police who work for the Canadian corporation Barrick Gold of serious human rights abuses against people living near the North Mara mine in northwestern Tanzania. Barrick Gold has declined to comment on the allegations. The son of the legendary Brazilian footballer Pelé says his father is reluctant to leave his house because he can't walk unaided. Pelé, who is 79, has had problems with his hip for some time and now needs a frame to walk. Many of his appearances have been in a wheelchair. BBC News.
Hello, you're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Emilio San Pedro. In his election year budget, President Trump has demanded big increases in U.S. military spending, including nuclear weapons, but he's also presenting cuts to social and environmental programs. Speaking at the White House, he said he believed the proposals would win wide approval.
We're putting out a plan today that over a period of not that long a period of time brings our budget and our deficit down to what it should be, which is close to zero. And I think people are going to be very impressed by it.
Well, our business reporter Samira Hussain joins us from New York. Samira, this is a very big and sweeping proposal. What struck you the most?
I think the things that really sort of came out the most for me was the 26% cut to the Environmental Protection Agency. That's a real sort of cut to this agency that is meant to protect the environment, and of course that has become at the forefront in terms of conversations amongst people, but this is really clearly something that the president has often wanted to do. That said, Congress has always resisted any of these kinds of pushes to make these kinds of sweeping cuts to the Environmental Protection Agency.
And does this budget have any chance of getting approval?
This is what you would call a first step in the long negotiation that is budgets here in the United States. In order to get a budget passed, you need the support of both houses of Congress, which the president does not have. So already when a president puts out a budget, it actually ends up being negotiated quite a bit. It's even worse now since we have such a divided and partisan government at the moment. So this is going to be a very long negotiation between Democrats and Republicans, between the White House and Congress, to try and get a budget passed.
And Samira, there are also big proposals there cutting major social services and also increases in defense spending.
Absolutely. He wants to increase how much would they spend for defense. We saw a 21% cut to foreign aid. We're seeing cuts from big safety net programs in the United States like Medicaid and food stamps. So these are all really things that we have heard the president talk about before, and he's made it abundantly clear in this particular budget that he's presented.
And also an expansion of America's nuclear weapons arsenal.
Yes, and one thing I would also add is that if you look at where he's allotting some funding, because the budget is not all about cuts, we're seeing increases as well for funding to the border wall, another $2 billion to try and fortify the southern border and to increase how many miles exist on that border wall. Now, it should be mentioned that the budget actually is trying to become, the federal debt rather has increased under this president to $23 trillion, and part of this budget is to try and address that.
Samira Hussein in New York, thank you. The crisis in Syria has deepened once again this week as pro-government forces directly clashed for the first time with Turkish troops stationed at a number of observation posts in the region. The Turkish soldiers are there ostensibly to oversee a ceasefire in Idlib that Turkey brokered with Russia last year. That ceasefire has broken down, and Turkey has sent in more reinforcements after a number of its soldiers were killed last week. Today has seen a new escalation in that confrontation, as Ankara says it hit 100 Syrian government targets in retaliation for another attack hours earlier on one of its observation posts, which killed 5 Turkish soldiers. Well, our Arab Affairs editor, Sebastian Usher, told me more about the significance of these clashes.
These are the first direct clashes between Turkish and Syrian government forces. So that's a new element in the conflict. And remember that the Syrian government forces are backed by Russia. Now, Russia and Turkey, although they've been backing opposite sides in the Syrian war, in recent years, in the past 2 or 3 years, they've worked together to try to broker ceasefire deals, and they've done this twice in Idlib. There's a ceasefire deal at the moment that's supposed to be in force, but of course, day in, day out, we're seeing it, effectively, it's completely finished. And those observation posts that Turkey has were there, again, ostensibly to oversee the ceasefire. Now, Turkey, since the attack last week, has moved in thousands more troops, a lot more military vehicles to strengthen those observation posts, but some of them are now surrounded by Syrian government forces. So the potential for this to continue to escalate, for it to become a new conflict within the conflict, is a very worrying issue. And also the fact that perhaps Russia and Turkey, as I say, which have come together to some extent, their interests aligning, could be drawn apart by this and could become a flashpoint between them and make the situation even more unstable.
And the human toll of all this fighting must be devastating.
Yes, the bigger offensive is the Syrian government forces against the rebels and the jihadists who control most of Idlib. And that's been going on since the start of December. We've seen, according to UN figures, around 700,000 people forced again from their homes. Many of them had already been forced out of other areas of the country, and they literally have nowhere left to go. The border, which is above them into Turkey, has been sealed. That's one of the reasons why the Turkish forces are in Idlib, to try to control the situation, to try to stop it getting further out of control, to try to prevent the Syrian government forces essentially from forcing this exodus towards the border. Thousands of people have been injured or killed in the fighting. So, we're hearing from aid providers in Syria, this is actually one of the worst, if not the worst, humanitarian situations that we've seen throughout the whole conflict. Remember, we're now 9 years into it.
Sebastian Usher. The U.S. has charged 4 Chinese military officers over a huge cyber attack on an American company. It alleges they stole the personal data of 145 million Americans in the attack 3 years ago. The Attorney General, William Barr, set out the charges.
I'm here to announce the indictment of Chinese military hackers, specifically 4 members of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, for breaking into the computer systems of the credit reporting agency Equifax and for stealing the sensitive personal information of nearly half of all American citizens, and also Equifax's hard-earned intellectual property. This was one of the largest data breaches in history.
Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera told me more.
These are 4 officers from the People's Liberation Army's 54th, the research institute, a component of the Chinese military, according to the US officials, and they're alleged in 2017 to have hacked into, to gain access to the Equifax databases, and then ran 9,000 1,000 queries on the system and use that to obtain names, birth dates, social security numbers for nearly half of all U.S. citizens.
And this isn't the first time the U.S. has charged members of the Chinese military with hacking U.S. companies. What are they hoping to achieve?
Well, it's interesting. The first major indictment came in 2014, and that was quite a big surprise and quite a big moment when they actually named and had pictures of some of the alleged hackers from the People's Liberation Army. Now, the truth is, these people are not going to be facing a U.S. courtroom. They're in China. There's no chance they'll be travelling to the U.S. or are likely to be arrested. The point about these indictments is to try and put pressure on China, to try and act as a deterrent to stop it acting in a certain way.
And has China made any comments about these arrests?
They haven't yet, but we'd expect them to deny it, as they've done in the past. I think they would likely also say that America also steals data from other countries. But I think what's interesting about this, and it was there in the indictment, was that there is an element in which the US is worried that China is accumulating large amounts of personal data about Americans and then could potentially use those for espionage, intelligence gathering to understand the US population. And there's been other breaches, for instance, of healthcare data, of government personnel records, now of credit reference data here in Equifax. And the worry is that this could all be collated and used to target and understand individuals, so having that large amount of data.
Gordon Carrera. A group of Tanzanians have launched a legal case at the High Court in London against one of the world's largest gold mining companies. They're accusing the security forces and police, who work for the Canadian corporation Barrick Gold, of serious human rights abuses. The newsroom's Richard Hamilton reports.
The case concerns residents of villages near the North Mara mine in a remote part of northwestern Tanzania. The 7 claimants include the father of a 9-year-old girl who says his daughter was run over and killed by a vehicle belonging to the mine owners in July 2018. The girl's stepmother and other women who gathered around her say they were injured when security personnel fired on them without warning. The case is being brought by the human rights organizations Rights and Accountability in Development, or RAID, and Mining Watch Canada. Annika van Woudenberg, who's RAID's executive director, says this incident is just the latest in a catalogue of abuses at the mine.
This is just one example of dozens of different cases that we have documented of excessive use of force by mine security. Now that could be private security officials, but also the police, who the mine hire in order to provide security. Since this has been going on for years and years and years, one would expect by now that the company would say, we shouldn't be using the abuse of police, we should ensure that they are operating according to the law and not victimizing the local population.
RAID and Mining Watch Canada say that in the period from 2014 to 2016 alone, they documented 22 killings and 69 injuries at or near the mine. A previous British legal case against the owners was settled out of court in 2015. We've put these allegations to Barrick Gold, who've declined to comment.
Richard Hamilton, and now Stuart's here with some other stories from our news desk.
At least 9 people have died and 5 others injured after a lightning strike in central Mozambique. The victims were inside a church in Shia in the Marumbia district during a religious mass on Sunday. Extreme weather conditions have killed several people in the country since the rainy season began last October. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has asked officials to examine whether a bridge connecting Scotland and Northern Ireland is feasible. The most likely route would cover a distance of about 32 kilometres at an estimated cost of $20 to $25 billion. The Scottish government has expressed scepticism at the plans. And according to the US broadcaster ABC, this year's Oscars were watched by the award show's smallest ever television audience. Roughly 23.6 million viewers tuned in to Sunday's broadcast, a sharp drop of 20% from last year. The slump comes amid an industry-wide decline in linear TV viewing.
Thanks, Stuart. Ruby Williams, a British student who was repeatedly sent home from school because of the size of her afro, has received more than $10,000 in an out-of-court settlement. The BBC's Cameron Virk told me more about Ruby.
I've been following Ruby's story for the last few years. She is now 18 years old, but from the age of around 14, when she was sitting some of her most important school exams, She was being sent home repeatedly, being told by teachers that her hair was too big. So Ruby's a mixed race girl from East London. She has an afro, and the school's policy specifically stated that afro-style hair must be of a reasonable size and length. When we spoke with Ruby, she really made it clear how much of a important part of her identity her hair is.
Why should I have to cut my hair and people can have their hair all the way down to their hips and as long as they want, but because my hair grows out, I need to cut it. The styles that the school wanted me to do were difficult to do with my hair type because of how thick my hair is. If I flicked it down, it would always end up raising back up.
And this has become a very serious matter now because Ruby's family have taken legal action against the school.
Yeah, her mum saw the uniform policy on the school's website and thought it seemed a bit strange that it was singling out afro hair. And she sought advice, and actually the UK's Equality and Human Rights Commission, so a government body, decided that they would fund Ruby's case against the school. Obviously, as a young girl who was going through this every day, it really impacted on Ruby. And this is what she told me.
I ended up hating going to school. I felt like any time I would walk into the school with my hair out, all eyes were on me. For someone to care so much, it really just confuses me.
Ruby Williams speaking there to the BBC's Cameron Burke. A reminder of our main news, President Trump is seeking big increases in his proposed budget. That's all from us. You've been listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service.